The smell hit you first. That unique, terrifying cocktail of antiseptic, iron, and fear. In the ER of San Antonio Memorial, it was the permanent air freshener. For Sarah Jenkins, 11 hours into a 12-hour shift, it was just the smell of Tuesday. The rhythmic beep of monitors was her soundtrack, the frantic chatter of doctors and nurses her daily script. It was controlled chaos, a world she understood. Until the doors blew open. They didn't just wheel him in. He arrived on a wave of motion and sound, a half-dozen uniformed men in combat fatigues surrounding the gurney like a presidential motorcade. Their faces were grim, their movements sharp and urgent. In the center of it all lay the reason for the storm. A soldier. GSW? MVC? Sarah asked, her voice cutting through the noise as she met the gurney, her mind already cycling through the triage checklist. Training accident, a master sergeant barked, his eyes wide. Shrapnel from a misfired training mortar. He's losing it fast. Sarah's eyes scanned the patient. He was young, maybe her age, 26. His uniform was shredded and soaked a deep, dark crimson around his left hip and thigh. A makeshift tourniquet was high on his leg, but the blood still pulsed out, a sickening rhythm that was counting down his life. His face was pale, waxy. Dog tags peeked out from his collar. Rivera, M. Dr. Evans, the attending physician, a man whose permanent expression was a mask of weary competence, was already there. Trauma 1. Get me 2 wide-bore IVs, O-neg on the rapid infuser, and page ortho and vascular, now. Let's get a CBC, type and cross, and Coag panel. The team moved like a single organism, a blur of blue scrubs and focused intent. Sarah was on one side, slicing away the remaining fabric of the soldier's pants with trauma shears, while a resident worked on the other. The wound was a mangled horror of tissue and metal fragments. She pressed a thick stack of gauze into the wound, her entire body weight behind it, feeling the hot, slick blood soak through her gloves. Pressure's dropping, 80/40 and falling, someone shouted. Hang the first 2 units of O-neg, Evans commanded. The blood bag went up, a ruby-red promise of life. But as the first drops entered the line, the soldier's body began to twitch. A rash bloomed across his chest, violent and red. What the hell? Evans muttered, pushing closer. Anaphylaxis? It's O-neg, for Christ's sake. A nurse, reading from a tablet, rushed over from admissions, her face ashen. Doctor, we got his military medical records. He's O-negative, but he's Kell antigen negative, with a rare anti-JCA antibody. He's had a transfusion reaction before. Standard O-neg could kill him. The air went out of the room. Every eye darted from the monitor, where the blood pressure was now 70/30, to Dr. Evans's face. Kell negative. It wasn't a standard screen. It was a needle in a haystack. Blood bank, Evans yelled into his vocera. I need O-neg, Kell negative, JCA negative, stat. How much do you have? The voice that came back was tinny, laced with static and doom. None, doc. We have 0 units on site. South Texas Regional has some, but the chopper is at least an hour out, maybe more. An hour. Sarah looked at Sergeant Rivera. He didn't have 10 minutes. The beeping of his heart monitor was slowing, each beat more spaced out, more final. An hour was a death sentence. We can't just transfuse and hope for the best? A young resident asked, his voice trembling slightly. With that antibody? We might as well inject him with poison, Evans snapped, his mind clearly racing for an option that didn't exist. He looked at the dying soldier, then at the clock on the wall. A flicker of resignation passed over his face, the look of a man about to call time of death. Sarah saw it, and in that moment, she didn't see a random patient on a gurney. She saw her brother, Daniel, bleeding out in the dust of Helmand Province, waiting for a medevac that came too late. She remembered the clipped, sterile language of the casualty report. Expired due to exsanguination. He had bled to death. The system had followed its protocol, and her brother was gone. Her own blood was roaring in her ears, a frantic counter-rhythm to the dying monitor. She looked at Rivera's dog tags, then at her own ID badge, which had a small, proud sticker on the back. O-negative donor. She knew her full type. Her father, a paranoid ex-Army Ranger, had insisted she and Daniel have their blood fully screened and typed after a scare when they were kids. She was O-negative, Kell negative, JCA negative, a universal 1 in a million match. The idea was insane, prehistoric, something you'd read about in a Civil War medical journal. A direct transfusion, person to person. It wasn't just against protocol. It was a concept so far outside the bounds of modern medicine that it didn't even have a protocol to be against. It was malpractice, it was career suicide, it was, quite possibly, his only chance. "Doctor," Sarah said, her voice quiet but firm, cutting through the tense silence. Evans looked at her, his eyes distracted. "What is it, Jenkins?" "I'm a match," she said. "A perfect match. We can do a direct transfusion." Evans stared at her as if she'd just suggested using leeches. A humorless, incredulous laugh escaped his lips. "Absolutely not. Are you out of your mind? The legal risk alone. We don't have the equipment, we don't have the protocol. It's barbaric. We are not doing it." "He's dying," Sarah pushed, her voice rising. "There is no other option. We have IV lines, we have tubing. We can make it work." "No." Evans's voice was a whip crack. "I will not have this hospital sued back to the Stone Age because you had a sentimental impulse, nurse. We follow the procedure. We do what we can." He turned away, a clear dismissal. He was preparing to let the man die by the book. The monitor let out a long, continuous tone. V-fib. He was crashing. "Get the paddles!" They shocked him. The body on the table jumped. A weak rhythm returned, thready and fast. But it wouldn't last. He was a container emptying faster than they could fill it. Something inside Sarah broke. Or maybe it solidified. She saw Daniel's face, smiling at her from his graduation photo. She heard the chaplain's hollow words at his funeral. He served with honor. This man, Rivera, had served with honor. He deserved to live with honor, not die on a technicality in a sterile room thousands of miles from any war. Screw the book. While Evans was distracted, barking orders for another round of epinephrine, Sarah moved. She grabbed a 16-gauge needle, a blood transfusion kit, and a length of tubing. Her hands didn't shake. Her mind was unnaturally clear, focused on a single, defiant purpose. She strode to the side of Rivera's gurney, opposite from where the doctors were working. She found a good vein in his arm, one not already blown by other attempts. The young resident, the one who'd asked the trembling question earlier, watched her, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe. "What are you doing?" he whispered. "My job," Sarah said, her voice low and intense. "Help me or watch him die, your choice." She didn't wait for his answer. She tied a tourniquet around her own bicep, slapped the inside of her elbow until the vein popped, plump and blue. She slid the large-gauge needle into her own arm, the sharp sting a welcome confirmation of her choice. Blood, her blood, filled the line. She handed the other end to the resident, who, after a moment of paralyzed indecision, took it. He connected the tube to the catheter in Sergeant Rivera's arm. Dr. Evans turned just in time to see it. "Jenkins, so help me God, you stop right now. I order you to stop." But it was too late. Sarah squeezed her fist, and her life force, warm and rich, and a perfect 1 in a million match, began to flow from her body into his. She watched his monitor. After a few agonizing seconds, the impossible happened. The pressure, which had been hovering in the 60s, ticked up 75/40, then 80/50. The jagged, panicked rhythm of his heart began to smooth out, to find its strength. The ER was silent, save for the steady, strengthening beep of the monitor. Sarah felt a wave of dizziness but locked her knees, refusing to faint. She had done it. She had ignored a direct order, violated a dozen regulations, and likely destroyed her career. But Sergeant Rivera was no longer dying. And in the stunned, ringing silence of Trauma Bay 1, that was the only thing that mattered. The hour that followed was a blur. As soon as Rivera was stable enough, the vascular and orthopedic surgeons wheeled him up to the OR, their expressions a professional mixture of curiosity and stern disapproval. The moment the gurney was gone, the fragile bubble of shared purpose popped, leaving behind a cold, awkward vacuum. The other nurses wouldn't quite meet Sarah's eyes. They moved around her carefully, as if she were a live wire. The master sergeant who had escorted Rivera in simply stared at her for a long moment, his mouth slightly agape, before being ushered out by hospital security. Dr. Evans didn't yell. He didn't scream. He did something far worse. He walked over to where Sarah was sitting on a stool, a tech applying a pressure bandage to her arm. He didn't look at her. He just looked at the now clean floor where Rivera had been moments before. "Go home, Jenkins," he said, his voice flat, devoid of any emotion. It was the voice of a man who had already washed his hands of a situation. "Doctor, she started. There was nothing to say. He cut her off, finally turning to face her. His eyes were like chips of ice. You performed an unsanctioned, undocumented, and reckless procedure on my patient in my trauma bay against my direct order. You may have saved him. You may have killed him. We won't know the full extent of the immunological consequences for hours. What I do know is that you have exposed this hospital to a catastrophic level of liability. So, you will clock out, you will go home, and you will not come back until you are told to. Is that clear? It was. Sarah nodded, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the blood she had lost. She slid off the stool, her legs a little unsteady. Her shift supervisor, a kind older woman named Maria, quietly handed her purse. Maria's face was etched with pity. "Be careful, honey," she whispered, a quiet warning. The walk out of the hospital was the loneliest of Sarah's life. The familiar halls felt alien, the cheerful posters about patient care and hospital values seeming to mock her. Every doctor and nurse she passed felt like a judge. Had word already spread? Was she now Crazy Jenkins, the nurse who practiced battlefield medicine in a state-of-the-art trauma center? Her small apartment was quiet and dark. She didn't bother turning on the lights, just dropped her keys and purse on the counter and sank onto the sofa. The adrenaline that had sustained her was gone, replaced by a deep, trembling exhaustion. But beneath the fear, a stubborn flicker of pride remained. She had looked death in the face and spit in its eye. She had refused to be a passive witness to a preventable tragedy. Her gaze fell on the framed photograph on her side table. It was of her and Daniel, taken the week before his final deployment. They were both grinning, Daniel in his crisp marine dress blues, looking impossibly young and invincible. He had been her hero, the one who taught her how to be brave. After his death, Sarah had funneled her grief into her career, determined to become the kind of nurse who could have saved him. She'd graduated at the top of her class, priding herself on her precision, her knowledge of protocol, her ability to remain calm in a crisis. Until today. Today, she had honored his memory by breaking every rule she had ever sworn to uphold. Would he have been proud, or would he have called her a reckless fool? She didn't know the answer. She just knew that when she had looked at Sergeant Rivera, she had seen her brother's ghost, and she couldn't bear to lose him again. This conviction was the only thing holding the terror at bay, the terror of losing her job, her license, everything she had worked for. Her phone buzzed, a harsh sound in the silence. It was a text message from Maria. From Maria Sanchez. Subject: Update. Sarah, just got out of the shift change meeting. It's bad, Crestwood is involved, legal is drafting a statement, you're officially suspended, pending a full review. They said not to come back to the hospital for any reason. I'm so sorry, be smart. Crestwood, the hospital administrator, a man who saw patients as profit margins and doctors as assets. Sarah's heart sank. This was no longer an internal ER matter. This was going to the top floor. The phrase, "get your affairs in order," echoed in her mind, no longer a piece of angry hyperbole but a chillingly practical piece of advice. She leaned her head back against the couch and closed her eyes, the rhythmic beep of Rivera's stabilizing heart monitor still echoing in her ears. It was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. She just hoped it wasn't the last sound of her career. Sleep didn't come. Sarah spent the night drifting in a state of anxious limbo, replaying the events in the ER over and over, each time seeing a new angle of her own professional demise. By morning, the gray light filtering through her blinds felt accusatory. Every creak of the apartment building, every car that passed on the street below, sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through her, a Pavlovian response to the anticipated arrival of a process server with a lawsuit, or, worse, police officers with a warrant. So when the knock came at 8 a.m., it wasn't a surprise. But it wasn't the hesitant tap of a server. It was a sharp, percussive sound. 3 distinct, authoritative raps that seemed to vibrate through the very frame of the door. This wasn't a civilian knock. It was a military knock. Sarah's blood ran cold. She smoothed down her wrinkled scrubs from the day before. She hadn't even had the energy to change and walk to the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. She peered through the peephole, and her breath hitched. Standing on her welcome mat was a man who seemed to have stepped directly out of a recruiting poster. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his face a roadmap of discipline and command. His uniform was immaculate, a deep army green, adorned with a chest full of ribbons and, on each shoulder, 3 gleaming silver stars. A lieutenant general. Behind him, standing at parade rest, was a younger captain holding a briefcase, his eyes fixed forward. This was so much worse than she had imagined. This wasn't just about hospital liability anymore. She had interfered with a member of the armed forces. Was this a federal matter? Espionage? She fumbled with the lock, her hands shaking, and opened the door. The general was even more imposing up close. He had to duck his head slightly to look at her. His eyes, a piercing blue, held no malice, only an intense, unreadable scrutiny. "Miss Sarah Jenkins?" he asked. His voice was a low gravel, a sound that could command armies. "Yes, sir," she squeaked out. "I am Lieutenant General Wallace Thorne," he said, his gaze unwavering. "May I have a moment of your time?" It wasn't really a request. Sarah just nodded dumbly and stepped back, allowing the two men to enter her small, cluttered apartment. They seemed to take up all the available oxygen in the room. The captain remained standing by the door, while the general walked to the center of her living room, his polished boots silent on her cheap laminate flooring. Sarah stood awkwardly, her hands clasped in front of her, feeling like a raw recruit at her first inspection. She braced for the impact. The lecture. The formal notice of charges. The end of her life as she knew it. General Thorne took a slow breath, his eyes scanning her face. "I'm not here to cause you any trouble, Miss Jenkins," he began, his tone softening slightly. "In fact, I'm here for precisely the opposite reason." He paused, letting the statement hang in the air. "I've just come from the hospital. I was sitting by the bedside of Sergeant Mark Rivera." Sarah's heart leaped into her throat. "Is he?" "He's stable," the general finished, a flicker of warmth in his eyes. "He's weak, but he's alive. The surgeons are calling it a miracle. They said he had no business surviving the transport, let alone the table. They said that by the time he got to the OR, his vitals were already on the upswing. Because of you." Sarah didn't know what to say. "I was just doing my job, sir." The general's lips thinned into a wry smile. "With all due respect, nurse, what you did was far outside the definition of your job. I've read the preliminary report from Dr. Evans. I know you disobeyed a direct order. I know you performed a procedure that hasn't been standard practice in a century. I know you risked everything." He took a step closer. The intensity in his gaze was overwhelming. "Mark Rivera isn't just another soldier to me. His father was my first command sergeant major in Iraq. I've known that boy since he was in diapers. He's also one of the finest combat medics this army has ever produced. He's saved more than 100 soldiers on the battlefield, pulling them from burning Humvees and patching them up under fire. He is, to put it plainly, an asset we cannot afford to lose." He let that sink in before delivering the final, stunning blow. "So, I am not here as a general today, Miss Jenkins. I am here as a grateful old soldier, to personally and profoundly thank you for saving the life of one of my best men." The relief that washed over Sarah was so immense, she felt her knees buckle. She grabbed the back of a chair to steady herself. "Thank you, sir," she whispered, but the general held up a hand. The warmth in his eyes was replaced by a look of grim pragmatism. "But now," he said, his voice dropping back to its command tone, "I have to speak to you as a general. You need to understand the machine you just threw a wrench into." He gestured for his aide, who opened the briefcase and handed him a folder. "Your hospital is in full panic mode. They're terrified of the lawsuit. That's predictable. What you might not understand is the military's perspective. We spend millions of dollars and years training a soldier like Rivera. We have protocols in place for every eventuality designed to protect that investment. You went outside those protocols. You introduced an unknown variable. You, a civilian, made a unilateral decision regarding a piece of military equipment, for lack of a better word." He saw the flash of anger on her face at that term and nodded. "I know it sounds cold, but that's how the bureaucracy sees it. They are not grateful, they are not impressed, they are furious. An investigation has already been launched by MedCom, our medical command. They will be thorough, and they will be unforgiving. They see your actions not as heroism, but as a dangerous precedent." He stepped forward and placed a business card on her counter. "This is the name and number of a colonel in the JAG Corps. He's one of the best defense attorneys in the service. He owes me a favor. His counsel will be provided to you, free of charge. I suggest you call him. Today." The fear was back, coiling in Sarah's stomach. She had an ally, a powerful one, but he was confirming her worst fears. She hadn't just angered a hospital administrator. She had angered the United States Army. "While I am personally in your debt," General Thorne concluded, his voice low and serious, "my influence only extends so far. I can't stop the investigation. I can only try to mitigate the fallout. The system is a slow, stupid beast, nurse. And you just woke it up. Be ready. They will come for you, not with guns, but with clipboards and lawyers. and they are very, very good at what they do." With that, he gave a crisp nod, turned, and walked out of her apartment, his aide following silently behind him. The door clicked shut, leaving Sarah alone in the sudden silence, the general's business card sitting on her counter like a ticking bomb. The general's warning proved to be an understatement. The siege began less than 24 hours after his visit, and it was a multi-front war, fought not with weapons, but with condescension, veiled threats, and the suffocating weight of institutional power. The first front was the hospital. Sarah was summoned via a cold, impersonal email to a meeting. The subject line read, "Mandatory review regarding employment status." She walked into a polished boardroom on the top floor of the hospital, a place she'd only ever seen in promotional videos. On one side of a long mahogany table sat Mr. Alan Crestwood, the hospital's CEO, flanked by two sharp-suited lawyers from the hospital's legal firm. On the other side was a single, empty chair. Crestwood was a man in his late 50s with perfectly coiffed silver hair and a smile that never reached his cold, calculating eyes. He gestured to the empty chair without standing up. "Miss Jenkins, thank you for coming." Sarah sat, her back ramrod straight. The JAG lawyer, Colonel Miller, had prepped her over the phone. "Be polite, be concise. Do not volunteer information. They are not your friends. Their only goal is to protect the hospital, and right now, you are the threat." "As you know," Crestwood began, steepling his fingers, "we are here to discuss the incident in the ER on Tuesday evening. We have reviewed Dr. Evans's report and the statements from the other staff members, and frankly, we are appalled." One of the lawyers, a woman with a severe haircut, slid a document across the table. "This is a summary of the protocols you violated, Miss Jenkins. 17 of them, to be exact, ranging from patient consent and unsanctioned procedures to insubordination and the reckless endangerment of a patient." "I saved his life," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Crestwood let out a sigh, the sound of a patient man dealing with a willful child. "What you did, Miss Jenkins, was play God with hospital property and personnel, without the training, authority, or foresight to do so. You exposed Sergeant Rivera to untold immunological risks. You exposed the attending staff to disciplinary action. And you exposed this institution to a lawsuit that could potentially bankrupt us. Your personal feelings about the patient's prognosis are, respectfully, irrelevant." The other lawyer chimed in, his tone smooth and oily. "Imagine, for a moment, that your experiment had failed. Imagine Sergeant Rivera had died on the table, your blood in his veins. We wouldn't just be facing a lawsuit from his family, the Department of Defense would be launching a federal investigation. You didn't just save a man, Miss Jenkins. You gambled with the future of this entire hospital." The condescension was suffocating. They spoke of Rivera not as a human being, but as a trigger for a lawsuit. They spoke of her actions not as a desperate act of life-saving, but as a foolish gamble. "Therefore," Crestwood said, delivering the final blow, "effective immediately, your employment with San Antonio Memorial is terminated for gross misconduct. Your final paycheck will be mailed to you. We will be contesting your unemployment claim. And we are reserving the right to pursue criminal charges for assault and battery, pending the outcome of the military's investigation." He stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. "Security will escort you out." Sarah was left sitting in the chair, stunned into silence, the air tasting of defeat. They hadn't just fired her, they had branded her a reckless criminal. The second front opened 2 days later. An official summons arrived, ordering her to report to an administrative building on the nearby Fort Sam Houston for an interview with Medcom. The office she was led to was sterile and gray, furnished with a metal desk and 2 chairs. Sitting behind the desk was a woman who radiated an aura of cold, unyielding authority. Her nameplate read, Colonel Eva Rostova. Colonel Rostova was the polar opposite of General Thorne. Where he was pragmatic and warm, she was rigid and glacial. She had dark hair pulled back in a severe bun, and her eyes, behind a pair of wire-rimmed glasses, missed nothing. She did not offer Sarah a seat. Sarah simply took one. "Let's be clear, Miss Jenkins," Rostova began, her voice crisp and devoid of any inflection. She didn't consult any notes. "I am not here to thank you. I am here to understand the catastrophic breakdown in judgment that led you to violate nearly 2 decades of established medical and military doctrine." For the next 2 hours, Rostova subjected Sarah to a relentless, soul-crushing interrogation. Her questions were surgical strikes, designed to dismantle Sarah's confidence and paint her as unstable. Were you experiencing emotional distress at the time of the incident, Miss Jenkins? No, Colonel. Your file mentions a brother, Daniel Jenkins, a Marine Lance Corporal, killed in action. Did the sight of a soldier in uniform trigger a stress-induced response? I was focused on saving my patient. You refer to him as your patient, Rostova countered, a hint of steel in her voice. But at the moment you disobeyed a direct order from the attending physician, he ceased to be your patient, and you ceased to be his nurse. You became a civilian performing an unsanctioned, unmonitored medical experiment on a U.S. Army soldier. Is that not correct? She twisted every answer, every motive. Sarah's compassion was reframed as emotional compromise. Her quick thinking was impulsive recklessness. Her defiance was a dangerous God complex. The United States military, Rostova said, leaning forward, her voice low and dangerous, is an organization built on protocol. Protocol is what separates us from a mob. It is what ensures a soldier wounded in Texas receives the same standard of care as one wounded in a combat zone. It is predictable. It is safe. Your sentimentality, Miss Jenkins, your single act of emotional self-indulgence, has jeopardized that entire system. You have shown every nurse, every doctor, that protocol is optional if they feel strongly enough about something. What you call heroism, I call chaos. The interview ended with a chilling statement. My report will reflect my findings. You should be aware that willful interference with military personnel is a federal offense. The third front was quieter, but in some ways, more humiliating. As part of the hospital's official complaint, the San Antonio Police Department had to take her statement. 2 officers, a man and a woman, showed up at her apartment. They were professional, almost apologetic, but they had a job to do. They sat at her small kitchen table while she recounted the story for what felt like the 100th time. But their questions were different. They weren't about medical protocol, they were about consent. Did Sergeant Rivera ask you to give him your blood, ma'am? The female officer asked gently. He was unconscious, Sarah replied, her throat tight. So, you did not have his consent to perform this procedure? I had a moral obligation to act. We understand, ma'am, the male officer said. But legally speaking, you initiated physical contact of a medical nature without the patient's consent. That is the technical definition of battery. Battery. The word hung in the air of her small apartment, ugly and absurd. She was a nurse. She had dedicated her life to healing. And now, she was being investigated for assault. The officers left, leaving behind a form with a case number on it. Sarah sank onto her couch, feeling besieged from all sides. Crestwood saw her as a liability. Rostova saw her as an agent of chaos. The police saw her as a potential criminal. They were all just doing their jobs, following their protocols. Their systems were working perfectly, and in the process, they were methodically, efficiently, and impersonally crushing her. The day of the hearing before the Texas Board of Nursing was gray and overcast, a perfect mirror for Sarah's mood. This felt like the final act. Losing her job was devastating. Being investigated was terrifying. But losing her license? That was an erasure of her very identity. She wasn't Sarah Jenkins, fired employee. She was Sarah Jenkins, RN. Without those 2 letters after her name, she didn't know who she was. Colonel Miller, the JAG lawyer, met her at the entrance to the state administrative building. He was a small, wiry man with a surprisingly calming presence. Remember, he said, adjusting his tie, they want to make an example of you. To prove the system works and renegades get punished. Our job is to make you human, to make them see the man you saved, not just the rules you broke. The hearing room was designed to be intimidating. It was paneled in dark wood, with a raised dais where the 5 board members sat, their faces impassive. In the gallery behind her, Sarah could see Mr. Crestwood sitting with his legal team. And in a corner, observing silently, was Colonel Rostova, her presence a cold weight in the room. The hospital's lawyer, the same sharp-suited man from the boardroom, went first. He was masterful in his presentation, painting a picture of a rogue nurse, driven by an unstable emotional connection to a past trauma. He called Dr. Evans to the stand, who reluctantly testified that Sarah had disobeyed a direct, unequivocal order. He called a medical expert who spoke at length about the immense dangers of direct transfusions, air embolisms, clerical errors, unknown pathogens, severe immunological reactions. He made Sarah's successful outcome sound like a 1 in a billion fluke, a case of dumb luck, not skill or judgment. Then, it was Sarah's turn to take the stand. The hospital's lawyer approached her, his smile predatory. "Miss Jenkins," he began, "you are not a doctor, are you?" No, sir, I'm a registered nurse. And you are not a hematologist? No, sir. Yet you took it upon yourself to diagnose a complex hematological issue and prescribe a radical, archaic course of treatment, all within the space of a few minutes and against the orders of a physician with 20 years of experience. Is that an accurate summary? I saw a man dying, and I saw a way to save him, Sarah said, her voice quiet. You saw a way to gamble with his life. The lawyer shot back. A gamble that, by all medical logic, should have failed catastrophically. Let's talk about your brother, Miss Jenkins. Lance Corporal Daniel Jenkins. A tragic loss. Is it fair to say that when you see a man in uniform, you feel a particularly strong emotional connection? I respect the uniform, Sarah said, bristling. So much so that your professional judgment is compromised? So much so that you're willing to throw the rulebook out the window? Would you have done the same for a civilian? A homeless man? Or was it the uniform that made you act so heroically? It was a cruel, calculated trap. He was painting her as a loose cannon, her motivations suspect, her actions driven by unresolved grief. Sarah felt her composure begin to crack. She could see the board members exchanging glances. They were buying it. Crestwood looked smug. Rostova's expression was unchanged, a mask of cold vindication. Colonel Miller stood up for his redirect. He only had a few questions. Nurse Jenkins, he said, his voice calm and steady. Why did you become a nurse? To help people, she answered simply. In all your training, in all your experience, what is the single most important duty of a nurse? Sarah looked not at her lawyer, but directly at the board members. To be an advocate for your patient, to be their last line of defense when they are at their most vulnerable. And was Sergeant Rivera vulnerable? He was dying, she said, a tear finally tracing a path down her cheek. He was dying, and the people in charge of saving him had given up. Miller nodded slowly. No further questions. The board chair, a severe-looking woman named Mrs. Albright, looked down at her notes. The board will now deliberate. Excuse me, Madam Chair. The voice came from the back of the room. It was deep and carried an easy authority. The doors opened, and General Wallace Thorne entered. He wasn't alone. He was pushing a wheelchair. In it sat Sergeant Mark Rivera. A murmur went through the room. Crestwood sat bolt upright. Colonel Rostova's eyes narrowed. This is highly irregular, General, the chairwoman said, clearly flustered. Life is irregular, ma'am, Thorne said, wheeling Rivera to the front of the room. Rivera was pale and thinner than he should be, his leg in a complex-looking brace, but his eyes were clear and fiercely alive. Sergeant Rivera has a statement he wishes to make. The hospital's lawyer jumped to his feet. I object. This is a hearing about protocol, not patient testimonials. His presence is prejudicial. Objection overruled, the chairwoman snapped. Her curiosity clearly piqued. The board will hear from Sergeant Rivera. Rivera cleared his throat, his voice raspy but strong. He didn't look at the board. He looked at Sarah. I've been a combat medic for 8 years, he said. I've put my hands in chests and held hearts that were still beating. I've packed wounds with my own shirt. I've done things that aren't in any textbook to keep my guys alive long enough to get them to the surgeons. In the field, there's only one rule. You do what it takes. The protocol is whatever saves the life in front of you. He shifted his gaze to the board, his eyes burning with intensity. When I woke up in that hospital bed, they told me what Nurse Jenkins did. They called it reckless. They called it a violation. They told me I was lucky to be alive. They were wrong. Luck had nothing to do with it. He looked back at Sarah, his expression one of profound gratitude. That nurse didn't break protocol. In the middle of that clean, safe, civilized hospital, she was the only one who understood the reality of the battlefield my body was on. The rules exist to save lives. But when the rules are about to fail, you need someone who won't. She didn't break protocol. She was the protocol. He finished, breathing heavily from the effort. The room was utterly silent. The legal arguments, the expert testimony, the accusations, it all seemed to evaporate in the face of the simple, undeniable truth sitting in the wheelchair. Here was the result of Sarah's choice. Here was the life that had been saved. Sarah locked eyes with Rivera, and for the first time in days, she felt a surge of something she thought she had lost forever: hope. The silence that followed Sergeant Rivera's testimony was profound. It was as if the air itself was holding its breath. The 5 board members on the dais no longer looked impassive. Their professional masks had been replaced by expressions of deep contemplation. Mr. Crestwood's smugness had vanished, replaced by a nervous agitation. Colonel Rostova was the only one who remained completely still, her face an unreadable cipher. The board chair, Mrs. Albright, finally cleared her throat. The board will take a 1-hour recess to deliberate. The hour was agony. Sarah sat with Colonel Miller and General Thorne in a small, sterile waiting area. General Thorne had brought her a cup of water, his large hand resting reassuringly on her shoulder for a moment. "You did good, kid," he'd rumbled. "Whatever happens in there, you held your ground." When they were called back in, the atmosphere had changed. The hostility was gone, replaced by a sense of weary resolution. Mrs. Albright adjusted her glasses and read from a prepared statement. "The board has reviewed the testimony and evidence presented today. It is undeniable that Nurse Sarah Jenkins violated numerous established protocols and acted in direct contravention of a physician's order. Such actions, under normal circumstances, would warrant the immediate and permanent revocation of her nursing license." Sarah's heart plummeted. This was it. "However," the chairwoman continued, looking up from her paper and directly at Sarah, "these were not normal circumstances. While the board cannot and does not condone the practice of unsanctioned medical procedures, we also cannot ignore the outcome. The primary duty of this board is to protect the public. In this specific, extraordinary instance, Nurse Jenkins's actions, while unorthodox, resulted in the preservation of a life that would have otherwise been lost." A wave of dizzying relief washed over Sarah. "Therefore, the board has reached a decision. We will not be revoking Nurse Jenkins's license." A quiet gasp escaped Sarah's lips. "But," Mrs. Albright added, her voice turning stern again, "we cannot let such a flagrant disregard for the chain of command go without consequence. Nurse Jenkins, you will be issued a formal letter of censure, which will be placed in your permanent file. Furthermore, your nursing license will be placed on a probationary status for a period of 12 months, during which you will be required to complete an additional 40 hours of ethics and protocol training." It was a slap on the wrist and a brand on her soul all at once. She wasn't a criminal, but she was officially marked a pariah. "As for the hospital," the chairwoman said, glancing towards Crestwood, "we strongly recommend you review your internal policies regarding emergency blood procurement to ensure a situation of this nature does not arise again." It was a subtle but clear rebuke. The hearing was over. As people filed out, General Thorne clapped Colonel Miller on the back. "Good work, Jim." He then turned to Sarah. "It's not a full win, but you're still in the fight. That's what matters." Mr. Crestwood walked past her without a word, his face a thundercloud. His termination of her employment was final. This verdict didn't change that. But worse, the censure and probation meant her career was effectively on ice. No hospital would hire a nurse on probation, especially one with a file that read like a cautionary tale. She was a hero to the public, the story had leaked, and news vans were camped outside the building, but within the medical community, she was radioactive. In the weeks that followed, Sarah learned the true meaning of professional isolation. She sent out dozens of resumes to hospitals, clinics, and private practices across the state. Most went unanswered. The few interviews she did get ended abruptly the moment the board's censure was mentioned. She was praised for her bravery in hushed tones, then politely shown the door. The word was out. Sarah Jenkins was a renegade. Too much trouble. Too much of a risk. Her savings began to dwindle. The initial pride and vindication from the hearing slowly eroded, replaced by a gnawing despair. She had won the battle but lost the war. She found herself spending her days aimlessly wandering her apartment, the silence a constant reminder of her forced inactivity. She, a person defined by action and purpose, had neither. The world was moving on, and she had been left behind. She had saved a life, but in the process, it felt as if she had lost her own. One dreary afternoon, as she was half-heartedly packing some of her medical textbooks into a box, what was the point of keeping them now? There was a knock at her door. It was that same familiar knock. Sharp, authoritative, military. She opened the door to find General Thorne standing there, this time in a simple polo shirt and slacks, looking more like a friendly neighbor than a 3-star general. "Am I interrupting anything?" he asked, gesturing to the boxes. "Just spring cleaning," she lied, a bitter smile on her face. He nodded, his expression knowing. "I heard about the job hunt. Not going well, I take it." Sarah just shrugged, the gesture heavy with defeat. "No one wants to hire the nurse who broke all the rules. That's because they're all afraid of the system," Thorne said, his voice laced with a familiar frustration. "They live by the book because they're terrified of the consequences of deviating from it. They manage risk. They don't take it. He paused, his eyes locking onto hers. I spoke with Colonel Rostova yesterday. Her final Medcom report came in. Officially, it states you acted with an unconventional disregard for established procedure. But unofficially, due to extenuating circumstances, my polite term for a public relations nightmare, she recommended no military or federal charges be filed. You're clear. That's great, Sarah said, the words sounding hollow even to her own ears. A clear record for a nurse who will never work again. That, the general said with a slow grin, is where you're wrong. He stepped inside, his demeanor shifting from casual to purposeful. I didn't just come here to give you the news, Sarah. I came here with a proposition. For the last year, I've been fighting tooth and nail to get a new project off the ground. A small, elite, joint service unit. Think of it as a hybrid between a para-rescue team and a forward surgical team. We're designed to deploy fast and light into disaster zones, both military and civilian, where the normal rules of engagement don't apply. A place where bureaucracy gets people killed. He leaned against the counter, his excitement palpable. The Pentagon finally signed off. I've been given command and a blank check to recruit the best. I'm not looking for soldiers who just follow orders. I'm looking for medics, doctors, and nurses who know how to think on their feet. People who understand that sometimes the mission requires you to write the protocol as you go. He looked at her, his blue eyes glinting. I'm looking for people who, when faced with a dying man and a broken system, aren't afraid to act. People who understand that the most important protocol is the one that keeps the heart beating. He slid an official-looking recruitment packet across the counter towards her. The unit doesn't have an official name yet, but on my desk, the project file has a working title. It's called the Heartbeat Protocol. I want you to be its first lead civilian nurse. Sarah stared at the packet, then back at the general, her mind struggling to process his words. This wasn't just a job offer. It was a validation. It was a purpose. It was a home for a renegade. A slow, genuine smile spread across her face for the first time in weeks, chasing away the shadows of doubt and despair. She hadn't just saved Sergeant Rivera's life by breaking the rules. She had inadvertently forged a new path for her own, a future where her greatest perceived flaw, her stubborn refusal to let a person die on a technicality, was now her greatest asset. She had a chance not just to work again, but to help build something new from the ground up, changing the system from within. She picked up the packet, the weight of it feeling solid and real in her hands. When do I start?